My name's Sophia. I'm a Jewish student and a member of the SWP, and I'm also very proud anti-Zionist. I'm going to be chairing the meeting today. We've got three brilliant speakers. As you can see, it's a panel discussion on Stop the Attacks, Palestine, Anti-Semitism and the Left. I'm going to introduce each speaker just before they start to speak, so you know we're not going to, so you don't forget who they all are and get confused, etc. I know it's been a long weekend. So our first speaker today is Tony Lerman.
No.
Oh, sorry, my bad. Last bit, I'm really sorry about that. Our first speaker today is Rob Ferguson, who is the author of a pamphlet which you can get at bookmarks on anti-Semitism, the far-right, Zionism and the left. And he is also a long-standing member of the SWP and a leading Jewish comrade in the fight for freedom of Palestine. So without further ado, Rob.
Okay. Well, for over 3 years, we've seen an unremitting onslaught in the UK, specifically on Corbyn and the Labour left, and on the Labour Party more widely, but also on the left and the pro-Palestine solidarity movement. And whilst I want to focus on how I think the left and the pro-Palestine solidarity movement should respond to this, I think it's worth just reminding ourselves of where we've come to over the last 3 years. There has, of course, been the political scalps that this attack has claimed, from Ken Livingstone to Mark Wadsworth, Jackie Walker, and Chris Williamson, who was here on Saturday, to name some. And really amongst these names are those who have a record on fighting racism, fascism and anti-Semitism that, to be honest, most of their detractors cannot claim. We're in a situation which Jewish activists in the Labour Party, like Naomi and others in JVL with whom I work, find themselves, can I put this down again? Yeah. Under threat of complaints, disciplinary proceedings and slander. We've seen the adoption of the IHRA definition not only by the Labour Party, but by hundreds of councils and institutions that use it as a reference point, with the effect of a suppressing effect on discussion of Israel and Palestine, and importantly, a suppressing effect on non-violent democratic forms of protest, as for example Anti-Apartheid Week on the campuses, and of course BDS. Now clearly a central aim of this attack is to mount a defence of the State of Israel and to silence criticism both from the Palestinians themselves and from the left. And crucially, I think it's worth to note, in particular, to crush any critique of the roots of Palestinian dispossession and oppression, not least from Palestinians themselves. But I think it's important to state that it is not limited to only a defence of Israel, an attack on Palestine, and this is manifested most clearly, isn't it, in terms of the attack on Corbyn and Labour. That those who are prosecuting this attack are opposed to the radical vision of a Labour government that is anti-war and anti-austerity. And of course, there's the wider agenda of an attack on the left and those who are opposed to war and military intervention in the Middle East. It's important to make an important caveat. It is not the case that anti-Semitism cannot permeate the Labour Party, the left and the pro-Palestine movement. in that it is no different to other forms of prejudice and racism. But this is not the motive for the attack, which is weaponizing any instance that it can find and many instances that are not anti-Semitic at all. In my view, the Chakrabarti report in early 2016 provided a good framework for dealing with both real instances of anti-Semitism and political confusion around the question of Israel and Jews. That report was deliberately sabotaged and shelved and blocked precisely because it did not lend itself to the cynical purposes of those prosecuting the attack. It should go without saying that anti-Semitism has no place in any labour movement organisation, but it's also important to say that it is false to argue that it is somehow rooted in forms of genuine socialist and left politics. It's a reactionary ideology, and its roots do not lie, as it is increasingly claimed, in anti-colonialism or anti-capitalism, but on the contrary, it has always been rooted in war, economic crisis, imperialism and racism. Socialism and internationalism are not the source of anti-Semitism, but the answer to it. And I want to focus on the question of how the left should respond. One thing to note here is the scale and international character of the onslaught, which sometimes perhaps can get lost when we're in the UK with the onslaught on Labour and Corbyn. Just in the last month or so, the Bundestag in Germany passed a resolution which contained this: the pattern of argument and methods of the BDS movement are anti-Semitic. A resolution that called on government and local government institutions to ensure they did not provide venues or any kind of support for any organisation that supported BDS. That resolution was passed by the ruling coalition of the Conservative CDU and CSU and the Social Democrats, the equivalent of the British Labour Party, the opposition Liberal Free Democrats and the Greens. And it has had an impact. Speakers and meetings have been pulled, as comrades from Germany and elsewhere outlined in the meetings yesterday. Peter Schäfer, the director of the Berlin Jewish Holocaust Museum, the Jewish Museum, sorry, in Berlin, was really forced to resign for refusing to accept the conflation between support for BDS and anti-Semitism. And I want to say this about the German Bundestag example. You see, once you conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, you give the far right a get-out-of-jail-free card. And we saw this with the AfD deputies in the Bundestag baying for BDS supporters to be criminalised and for BDS to be banned, to claim that they were the true supporters of Israel, the true supporters of settlers on the West Bank, and that the real enemy was the left and of course the Muslims. And that is being echoed by the far right, from Orban to Le Pen in France, right across Europe and of course in the United States. And I'm not simply making a political point here. The AfD is a real force in Germany, where there are a population of 5 million Muslims, around 5% of the population. And we've seen the same in France, where in last March, 300 dignitaries and political figures, including former prime ministers and so on, signed a statement saying that Muslim migrants were driving out Jews from Paris and calling for sections of the Quran to be excised, because allegedly they promoted violence and so forth. In the United States, we've seen the attack on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, an attack that both combines an attack on their position on Palestine and on BDS, but also on anti-racism and support for the refugees, as was manifested over the question when Cortez, quite rightly in my view, said that these detention camps on the border in Texas were in fact concentration camps. And the same weaponization has been used against the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, and notably Angela Davis, you know, the great tribune of black liberation. And it also has echoes here. Rabbi Jenna Klausner recently posted this. Most anti-Semitism used to be from the far right. Now we're seeing a disturbing change on the far left. Many people on the hard left have always accused Jews of being exploitative, colonialists and capitalist oppressors. The difference is those very people now have mainstream power. They're the leaders, not floundering at the margins. Okay? She then went on to claim that the Muslim community are disproportionately affected by anti-Semitism. We're seeing the same narrative come home to here. I just want to make one brief further point about the context, that this narrative of what goes under the new anti-Semitism began really to take off on a huge scale in the early 2000s, after 9/11, after the Second Intifada, after the wars in Iraq and the Middle East. And it has been forged as an ideological weapon against the left and the anti-war movements by the mainstream defenders of the establishment in Britain and internationally. And I want to make that point because sometimes I think there is a risk in seeing Israel somehow as the lone force and driver and prosecutor of these attacks. And of course it's at the forefront. Of course it takes every opportunity. But this would not be possible if this narrative hadn't been picked up on their own accord by the establishment and the neoliberal establishment internationally. So I want to finish with this, because I think in this context, how the left responds is critical. I just want to say something about how I think the dangers the left should avoid. First, and I know we have agreement here, to concede on the principle over the question of Palestine, to concede over the question of anti-Zionism being conflated with anti-Semitism, in the hope that somehow those who are attacking you will, the attacks will abate, and that somehow you can move on to a different agenda, has proved to be, and I think we all probably argued this right at the start, has proved to be disastrous. Secondly, there is another note of warning. See, I think sometimes there can be a temptation to say, look, we're not going to get engaged in the discussion and argument about anti-Semitism at all. We're just going to talk about Palestine. And it's absolutely right that Palestine has been silenced and we have to put it to the fore. But the problem is they're using this narrative precisely to silence and crush discussion and activity and campaigning around Palestine. The third note of warning is this, that there is a danger they push us into a bunker where we line up as the pure anti-Zionists against the hard Zionists and forget, the dynamic of the mass audience that we want to reach. So my argument here is this, that we have to remain principled and open in our defence of Palestine, oppose the conflation, but we need to keep our sights on the wider battlegrounds from which this assault comes. And crucially, mass opposition to the far right and the force that brought horror to Europe in the darkest hour of the last century, because there is mass opposition to those forces and mass opposition to the system out of which they grow.
we've got this microphone. It's a little bit crackly. What do you think, Naomi? Would you like to speak without one? Or
I
do you
don't
wanna
know.
try?
How's my voice at the back? Is that all right?
Okay, good. Yeah, no, it is. So, our next speaker is Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi. Sorry, I was just reading off
Sorry about my name.
She is, no, don't apologise, it's a lovely name. So she is a leading activist in Jewish Voice for Labour. She is also the executive producer of a film called Witch Hunt, which I'm sure we can all guess what that is about. And she's also a long-standing supporter of the BDS campaign, particularly, a cultural boycott, divestments and sanctions on Israel. So without further ado, I'd like to give Naomi the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. I want to start with a reference to the Witch Hunt film. Has everybody seen it? Has anybody seen it? Has anybody not yet seen it? Please do see it. It's available online, witchhuntfilm.org. Basically, there's a section in that film where Paul Kellerman, who's a Jewish academic who's written a book called The British Left and Zionism, History of a Divorce, you see him saying that in the 60s, Palestine was largely embraced by the people who came through the student movement at the time as part of the anti-racist, anti-colonial struggle, alongside Vietnam, alongside civil rights, alongside anti-apartheid. And that was a commendable feature, and obviously most of us in this room are probably the heirs of that realisation at that time. Unfortunately, that was not always the left position. Way back it was very different. I'll look at that again in a bit more detail in a minute. And now we're really seeing a situation where the left and its solidarity with Palestine is not a given anymore, and this is really a worrying trend. So I want to take a look at the way portrayal of Palestinians and their supporters as Jew haters has been a common current throughout the existence of Zionism, and it's been very familiar to those of us who were pro-Palestinian activists, but a real shock to people in the Labour Party who suddenly had it dumped on their heads and they just didn't know what had hit them. So I had to look at that. The battle over the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, so-called definition, because it isn't really, is it? The way it conflates Jews and Israel and Zionism, it's normalised this very dangerous association of those ideas in people's minds, and this is extremely dangerous. And so what's happened is that people on the left, so-called left, have accepted this sort of gross caricature of us as a sort of sinister red-green alliance, Muslims with those on the far left who, as Rob was alluding to, have this idea about Jews controlling the financial world and so on and so on. It's really a dangerous thing. Most of the discussion has been completely ahistorical. It doesn't ever look at the evolution of Jewish attitudes to Zionism, so we'll have to have a little bit of a look at that. And finally, the phony concern for anti-Semitism, as Rob's outlined, lots of the people behind this whole campaign have never been out on the streets combating fascists and the far right. They're just not there. So their concern is completely manufactured, and they're attacking genuine anti-racists, which risks boosting real anti-Semitism while weakening the only force that is really capable of calling a halt to all forms of racism, which are growing, as we know. So, there's all sorts of issues here. So if we go back to pre-World War I, the early left, the sort of progenitors of our labour movement, were embarrassingly racist in almost all respects. We have to remind ourselves of that. The leaders of the labour movement at that time, by and large, supported the Alien Act of 1905, which was to reduce the people like my grandparents and great-grandparents coming in to escape pogroms in Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. They were supportive of that. They bore within them the racist ideas of the time. Post-war, a lot of the leadership, and read Paul Kellerman's book if you want to learn more about this. It's quite shocking, actually, that post-war, after the defeat of Germany and the Ottoman Empire, lots of people on the left, they adopted this idea of a sort of benevolent imperialism, which would be a civilizing force that would go out and cultivate and develop the lesser races. I mean, they did use this language. It is absolutely shocking. And along came European Jews with this Zionist plan, which seemed to them as a sort of progressive form of colonialism that they could support. And you had an alignment between elements in the left, leading elements in the left, and the Zionist movement. And we're still living with that. We're still living with that now. And as then, the people who adopt this position are blind to the injustice being committed to, perpetrated on the Palestinian people, or indigenous people anywhere, in fact. So the question of portraying Palestinians and their supporters as anti-Semitic, and that goes way back, because the premise of the early Zionists was that the only way you could fight anti-Semitism was to separate out Jewish communities from those within which they lived, take them away to a new place, and obviously if you oppose that project, you must yourself be anti-Semitic, because why else would you oppose that project? And there's a lot more complexities in it, which Tony knows more about than most people, actually, so I hope he's going to tell us about that. So that's been a consistent thread anyway in the pro-Israel narrative. Come 2004 and the beginnings of the BDS movement, things really ratcheted up. And some of you may have heard of the Reut Institute in Israel, which formulated quite a detailed plan as to how they should set about delegitimizing the delegitimizers. So the boycott movement was seen as an attempt to undermine Zionism, to undermine the Israeli state, and therefore the job of this institute, or the project that it was supporting, would be to delegitimize us by labeling us as anti-Semitic. And they've been quite successful, haven't they? And the dirty tricks that they get up to through the Strategic Affairs Ministry, led by Gilad Erdan, which again, you can see all this in the Witch Hunt film. Please do make sure you spread it around. Were revealed in the Al Jazeera's lobby, four episodes of that. And you can see what they were up to, trying to paint a picture of what they call the hate net. It's quite amusing, really, the hate net. And it's a sort of catalogue of all the sort of pro-Palestinian human rights, pro-international law organisations, all labelled as part of this red-green sinister alliance. Now we've heard more recently about a new app under the heading of act.il, pushed out by Israeli-funded institutions, but all very shady, all very cloak and dagger. And they assign missions to people on university campuses. Anybody, any pro-Israel individual can sign up to this thing, and you're given a mission. Oh, Ilan Omar, let's target her. Let's see what we can push out about her. And it's all very subtle, and it'll pile in to discussions on Facebook, on Twitter. So all these sort of dirty tricks are being deployed to portray the supporters of Palestine as anti-Semitic. The battle over the IHRA definition, well, it's very ironic to someone like me. From the age of 15, I'm 66 now, I've spent all that time patiently explaining to people, yes, I know I'm Jewish, but that doesn't mean that I support Israel. It doesn't mean I'm a Zionist. You know, Jews are just like everybody else. They have different political ideologies, different political perspectives. And people will go, yeah, of course, I get that. Now that's illegal. If you say that now, you are an anti-Semite. It's really, and this is, the effect on free speech is actually quite terrifying. There is a purge going on in the Labour Party, but also in the wider society. And Rob's already mentioned what's been happening in Germany. We've seen what's happening in the United States. This is serious, and I find it hard to believe that people out there among the intelligentsia who claim to be passionate about freedom of speech don't seem to be picking up on this at all. Don't seem to be picking up on it. It's quite alarming, and I think we have to make them somehow take cognizance of the fact. So you'll get the people who support the IHRA definition saying, but friends, they'll say, you're perfectly at liberty to criticise Netanyahu. We hate him. Horrible man. Oh, you may oppose the occupation. You may speak about the excesses of the IDF in certain circumstances, but you must not question the underlying premises of the Israeli state. You must not question Zionism, because if you do that, you are threatening Jewish identity, because my Jewish identity is totally tied up with an association with Israel and with Zionism. which is not true, but this is the argument. And they've won that argument in so many liberal minds. People have bought into it. Look at Owen Jones, look at Ash Sarkar, look at Aaron Bastani, look at Billy Bragg. I mean, for goodness sake, did you see him the other day? So it's a battle that we have to win, I'm afraid. The question of it being a completely ahistorical argument that we're facing, nobody looks at the fact that pre-Second World War, pre-Nazi times, most Jews were either sceptical about Zionism or ignorant about it, or deeply, deeply opposed to it. And I'm sure most of you in this room, because you're all educated people, you would be here, you know about the Bund, you know about the Union of Jewish Workers in Eastern Europe, which was a mass political party, which absolutely opposed itself to the idea that Jews were somehow kind of special people who couldn't live with non-Jews, who had to be separated away from them in order to, survive and resist anti-Semitism. And their line was, no, that's not true. And I particularly like the concept of Deutschheit, which is like here-ness, where we are, this is our home. And that meant fighting in unity with other victims of oppression. And there are lots of us who still take that view, but we no longer exist in terms of the public discourse. We're the wrong kind of Jew. We're cranks. I can't deny that, really. But what we don't need in this situation is stoking genuine fears that Jewish people have because of centuries of persecution in the back of their minds by portraying the only political party that we have in this country that has a serious chance of combating rising anti-Semitism and rising racism, by portraying them as the enemy. This is what's so dangerous. This is absolutely absurd claims that if Jeremy Corbyn were in Downing Street, 300,000 Jews would pack their bags and leave because they'd be so fearful of being deprived of their rights. You'd imagine that synagogues were going to be shut down all over the place. It is madness. We know it's madness, but it has gained currency. So my conclusion is, and I back Rob up totally on this, we do have to be very clear on what anti-Semitism actually is. And we have to be clear that when comrades make mistakes, or sometimes people posing as comrades actually turn out to have hateful ideas, we have to call them out and we have to make clear that these things are not acceptable. I commend to you a little leaflet called Anti-Semitic Misconduct, What It Is and What It Is Not. It's not comprehensive, but it's a bit of an antidote to the IHRA thing. And it tells you what we really have to avoid. Conspiracy theories which at root suggest that Jews are responsible for some sort of financial cabal which controls the capitalist world. Don't go there. I mean, there are lots of other tropes that we need to avoid. So we've got to tackle them. We've got to confront all forms of racism together. And in the course of doing this, we have to promote justice for Palestine as part of a unified anti-racist struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. And our last speaker on the panel, before we have time for questions and contributions, etc., is Tony Lerman. He is a senior fellow at the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue in Vienna, and he's worked in the field of anti-Semitism and racism for over 30 years, and he is also writing a book which is due to come out very soon, which is called The Making and Unmaking, or is it out already? That one's... Sorry. Such a long day. Making and unmaking of a Zionist. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tony before I make any more.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. And is it okay if I sit down? It's late in the afternoon. So, just to half a sentence of introduction, I'm going to focus principally on a left strategy to deal with this problem set out in the title. As if...
You do need the mic.
I need the mic, sorry.
Sorry about that, I'm really sorry.
Let me get going. As if in anticipation of this session, the award-winning Nazareth-based journalist Jonathan Cook tweeted on Friday, And I quote, "When does the fiddling while Rome burns left wake up to what's happening? We've warned for 4 years that anti-Semitism is being weaponized. Jeremy Hunt calls Corbyn Hitler. The Spectator demands the destruction of Labour. How much further does this have to go?" End of his tweet. Sadly, I say to Jonathan, I think there's a lot further to go. There looks as if there's a lot of mileage in these attacks yet. Just when you think it can't get any worse, it gets worse. It erupted, originally with so much ferocity, it did not look as if it could continue at that level. Not only did it do precisely that, as time has gone by, the attacks have intensified, become ever more extreme. Cook was referring to Jeremy Hunt's disgusting statement on the 1st of July in which he implied that Corbyn's opening the door to anti-Semitism could lead to another Auschwitz. And Cook then referenced a piece by someone called Stephen Daisley on the Spectator's Coffeehouse blog in which he wrote, quote, "There is no more pressing moral cause in Britain today than the total destruction of the Labour Party. It has spent almost 4 years defaming, taunting and intimidating Jews. They have made Jews feel unsafe. They have made Jews feel un-British. There must be a reckoning for this intolerable measure of evil for both retributive and deterrent purposes." End quote. Pretty disgusting. And now we learn that an allegedly bombshell BBC Panorama documentary on Labour anti-Semitism is to be broadcast on Wednesday nights. Everybody know that?
Yeah.
It's made by John Ware, pro-Israel former Sun journalist, maker of libelous output, condemned as an Islamophobe, and already subject of complaint over a hatchet job he did on Corbyn in 2015 in the documentary. Now the temptation is to hit back, to defend every smear, every false accusation. And it's right to do that, of course. There should be no let up in what Jonathan Cook, as he communicated with me after his tweet, suggests, quote, "reminding the wider public that the double goal of weaponization is to undermine Corbyn and smother the issue of Palestinian rights as Israel lurches ever further rightward," end quote. Nonetheless, I don't know about you all, but wallowing in this filth is pretty dispiriting. I can understand why each and every episode demands attention and how that can create a bunker mentality. But let's get real. These attacks are not going to stop. The narrative will not be changed anytime soon. And why? Well, because the range of diverse political forces behind these attacks, most of which make no secret of what they're doing, see this as the gift that keeps on giving. It's great for right-wing politics since it undermines the opposition and masks their own racism. It's great for framing criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. A party that has a strong sense of the injustice done to the Palestinians, an avowedly pro-Palestinian leader, many members who support BDS, and also where a tiny minority have allowed their critique of Israel to become tainted by anti-Semitic tropes. Such a party is ripe for those intent on inculcating the notion that all of these are anti-Semitic. It's great for those who think defending Jewish people requires exaggerating the threat of anti-Semitism. Every false allegation that takes flight, getting halfway around the world before the truth can get its pants on, is grist to the mill of organisations like the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism. It's great for those pro-Israel and Zionist groups who are committed to promoting Jewish emigration to Israel. Anti-Semitism serves their cause. As the founding father of political Zionism, Theodor Herzl, who died in 1904, wrote in his diary, it is, quote, anti-Semites who will be our staunchest friends and the anti-Semitic countries which will be our allies, end quote. As you can see, there's a lot at stake. We're not going to beat these attacks by making counter-attack the left's primary strategic goal. With other goals, namely zero tolerance of racism and anti-Semitism, defense of the right and necessity of critiquing Israel and Zionism, and vigorously promoting Palestinian rights, bringing up the rear. This cannot be a serious left strategy, in my view. And it's not just because of the advantages that accrue to those mounting these attacks. The approach can be seen to be doubly wrong once we understand that underpinning the advantages that I've outlined, gained from weaponizing, from politicizing anti-Semitism, are two fundamental global changes. The first, Israel is central to, and has made itself so, the stability of the neoliberal order, which for the G20 and beyond depends on making common cause against jihadi terrorism and the demonizing of Islam and Muslims more generally. As a consequence, Jewish populations and communities are perceived and perceive themselves as vulnerable and in the front line against the perceived Islam threat. The Israeli government may publicly lament the fate of diaspora Jews, but these are crocodile tears, since Netanyahu has assiduously promoted Israel's front line against Islam status without any serious regard for the consequences of Jews worldwide. So Israel has become a neoliberal geopolitical necessity. It's become a neoliberal geopolitical necessity to support Israel and the choices it makes in regard to propagating its Zionist nationalist agenda and its new anti-Semitism agenda in diaspora Jewish populations. And lobbying for these positions in bodies like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, whose definition of anti-Semitism is in effect a codification of the new anti-Semitism. The second fundamental global change began in earnest in the 1990s. Rob already referred to this, and this was nothing less than a historical revolution in the understanding of anti-Semitism. This revolution was the emergence of the notion, or theory as it's sometimes called, of new anti-Semitism, which posits Israel as the persecuted collective Jew among the nations. This wholesale redefinition of anti-Semitism, putting Israel at its center, decouples anti-Semitism from our classic understanding of what it is, such that it became possible for something to be anti-Semitic, even though it bore no relation to the tropes and images of all those elements that make up our classic historical understanding of what constituted anti-Semitism. So determining who is and who is not anti-Semitic has become a matter of knowing whether they profess love of Israel or not. This opened the way for Netanyahu to court and legitimize the populist nationalist leaders of Russia, Poland, Hungary, the Netherlands, Brazil, Austria, the US, and so on, merely because... New voice. This opened the way for Netanyahu to cuddle up to these nationalist populist leaders and so on, merely because they profess love and admiration of Israel. No matter that they then get away with promoting classic anti-Semitism by relativizing the Holocaust, demonizing such Jewish figures as the financier and philanthropist George Soros, using anti-Semitic tropes when referring to Jewish liberal and progressive political opponents, and particularly those who are strong critics of Israel. How dangerous this is. Just as these far-right forces are strengthening, Jewish and Israeli leaders themselves are misguidingly facilitating their advance. I don't see anything changing on either of these two fronts, Israel's centrality to the neoliberal order and the redefinition of anti-Semitism. But rather than despair and retreat to the bunker, this should remind us that the left is not just about opposition, but about achieving fundamental change and transformation in people's lives, creating a society in which tolerating reserves of the oppressed and disadvantaged in the name of neoliberal stability is completely anathema, and securing equal rights for all. Only through working for change at that level will we ultimately neutralize the climate of fear and demonization that's been so devastating for the last 4 years. So for me, in this particular discussion, we need a guiding principle for a left strategy that combines support for Palestinian rights, contesting the conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and building a united anti-racist movement to tackle Islamophobia, anti-black racism, anti-Semitism, all forms of racism without exceptionalizing the experience of any group so affected. I take that principle from the US civil rights movement anthem, "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize." What this furore has done, and what is that prize? I'd say it's the true justice and equal rights for the Palestinian people. What this furore has done is marginalize even further an already very subdued Palestinian voice. And what a left strategy must do is put it front and center, generating hope that by focusing on achieving equal rights for all in Israel-Palestine, a grassroots Palestinian-led movement to attain, not to beg to be given, those rights can be built with the help and support of pro-Palestinian groups worldwide. The fundamental premises for this are recognition that the two-state solution is effectively dead in the water, that the state-based paradigm for achieving peace with justice is past its sell-by date, and that however difficult fighting for equal rights within what is effectively a one-state reality, for Palestinians a repressive, discriminatory reality that allows continued dispossession and ongoing Nakba and looks like only getting worse, this must be given a chance. In my experience, many Palestinian voices are seeing this as the way forward. At the annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture in May, which was in the form of a panel discussion, Hassan Jabarin, the founder and general director of Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, made a powerful case that equal rights have to come first. The promoters of the IHRA definition, those leading the charge to label BDS as anti-Semitic, bodies like BICOM, the main Israel lobby in the UK, that are intent on insisting that anti-Zionism is de facto anti-Semitic, these are frighteningly successfully encouraging the restriction of freedom of speech, challenging this by unapologetically deploying a critical discourse about the illiberalism of Zionism and the apartheid policies of the Israeli government as a basis for arguing for Palestinian equal rights now is an absolute necessity. An essential element of this is moving the Labour Party from its outdated two-state solution position to an equal rights-based policy. To achieve this, what's required is an open, extended policy debate, beginning at the level of CLPs that would, in my view, lead to the lancing of the boil within the party that has contributed so much to the persistence of the anti-Semitism row. And that is what is effectively a Jew-on-Jew war between the Zionist-affiliated Jewish Labour movement and the Jewish non-Zionist or anti-Zionist members, many of whom are members of Jewish Voice for Labour, remembering, of course, that both groups are non-Jewish members or associates too. A revitalised, united anti-racist movement with a Europe-wide focus is a perfectly natural fit with a strategic emphasis on Palestinian rights. The European far-right populists' anti-immigrant xenophobia makes no exception for the Palestinians, and we know that the populist disavowal of anti-Semitism is not only skin-deep, but also Janus-faced. This is a strategy requiring staying power. It's not a quick fix. There isn't one. This saga of the last few years still has a long way yet to run.